Trump or Harris. No matter who wins today, we could be headed towards an apocalypse of epic proportions. On the left side, we have the potential for Venezuela like hyperinflation and a civil war. On the right, we have a wannabe fascist dictator who could end free speech and democracy itself. This is why it's shaping up to be the perfect election for Gen Z doomers, whose philosophy is that we're screwed no matter what. But fear not, this isn't going to be such a pessimistic doomer video. This is actually going to be quite a fun doomsday apocalypse prediction video as we explore the absolute worst-case scenarios that could happen for both sides if they were to win. We all know no matter who wins, things aren't going to get better, but they could absolutely get a lot worse. How much worse? Well, let's get this show on the road to find out. Let's start with Vice President Harris. If she were to win, the first major apocalyptic event that's actually relatively likely to happen, in my opinion, is a second American Civil War. This is something that I think has a decent chance of actually happening, and not just a hyperbolic less than 1% doomsday scenario. To be clear, this isn't even something that would be her fault. It would be Trump's fault, but it would happen nonetheless. Trump made it clear in the last election that he won't accept defeat no matter what. If he loses, it must be because there was voter fraud. I don't know why there's magically never any fraud when he wins, but whatever. What if Althist, a popular Gen Z historian YouTuber with nearly 700,000 subscribers, has been ardently predicting a civil war in the US before the month of April. And he's basing this off thousands of years of historical parallels that he's drawn. He's gotten a lot of flack for this prediction, as many think he's just exaggerating. I think he's mostly right, but he's forgotten to include just one important variable. I do think a civil war is possible, but only if Kamala Harris wins. The political climate is more angry and polarized than ever now, but let's be honest. The left doesn't have the balls or the initiative to start a war if they lose. Trump supporters, however, absolutely do, and there's no reason to believe they wouldn't. The scary thing about this is Trump hasn't outlined a criteria for conditions in which he'd accept defeat. As far as we can tell, the only criteria is if he loses, there's fraud, and if he wins, there isn't. So no matter what his supporters will believe him, and in my opinion, it's not super unlikely they'll start a revolution over this. We saw January 6th last time that Trump supporters are perfectly willing to resort to organized revolution if they don't get what they want. This is why I don't get why people think, what if Althist's Civil War prediction is so outlandish? We weren't that far from a revolution last time around, so it's absolutely possible this time. Now let's say we somehow avert a civil war under a Harris presidency. The apocalyptic scenarios don't end there. In fact, they're just beginning. It's pretty safe to say this inflation crisis is going to continue to get worse under this administration. Technically, inflation has only been 4 to 8% per year under the Biden-Harris administration, but anyone who actually lives in America knows this is bullshit. The average rent back in 2019 before Biden took over was around $1,000 a month. Fast forward to today, and it's nearly double that. If this trend continues, how expensive will rent be by the end of Harris's first term? $3,000 a month? $4,000 a month? How expensive will everyday groceries be? There comes a point where consumers don't have enough money to buy anything and the entire economy crashes. If this is the case, we could be looking at another 2008-like crash of epic proportions. We haven't even talked about the migrant crisis, which is definitely only going to get worse under a Harris administration. Right now, migrants are already overloading and overflowing American cities and crushing our infrastructure and communities. It's pretty clear the motive for this sinister plan at this point. They want to import enough migrants to a point where they'll get their votes and never lose an election again. This time around, there were some safeguards in place from preventing Democrats from going completely overboard with this. The main one being that they at least had to pretend to be tough on the border with an impending election against Trump once again. But if they win this election, they'll likely have enough time in the next 4 years to import enough migrants to the extent where they'll literally never lose an election again, no matter what. This is the true doomsday apocalyptic scenario under a Harris presidency. Not only will things get much worse, but there will never be another chance to rectify things ever again, as the Democrats will have imported enough migrants to win every election from now on, and permanently continue their disastrous policies pretty much forever. That's pretty scary, isn't it? You didn't think I was going to be biased and only favor one side, did you? As bad as things could get under Harris, it could absolutely get as bad or even worse under Trump. So if you thought I was going to give you any semblance of false hope in this section of the video, burn your copium. I watched a video from Legal Eagle yesterday which, though I don't care about politics myself, was probably the best case against Trump I've ever seen. I'll link the video in the description below in case you're interested. Before you start chirping in the comments, I am aware there's a lot of biased, leftist content on YouTube and in the media. I don't think this was one of them personally. I could be wrong, but that's just my opinion. The gist of the video was this. From a legal, rule of law perspective, voting either Democrat or Republican is fine, and just depends on your policy preferences. What's scary about Trump is that he's just factually a criminal, with no regard for the rule of law or democracy. Unlike every other presidential candidate who understood the process of democracy, whether they won or lost, he tried to subvert the entire process of democracy itself when he tried to overturn the results of the election. This whole thing was based on the idea of voter fraud. And listen, I think it was all bullshit. If you're a Trump supporter, I get that you'll probably always believe there was fraud, and nothing will change your mind. But I just have a few questions. How come no other presidential candidate in our 250-year history lost due to voter fraud? How come Trump himself didn't complain about voter fraud when he won? Someone, magically, the one and only time in the history of our country that there was voter fraud was the one time he lost. But it doesn't stop there. The last election he also lost, the states of Arizona and Georgia, where Republicans won races in both the House and Senate. If you were going to commit voter fraud, why would you only commit fraud for the president? If you were willing to put yourself at risk for a federal crime and jail time, wouldn't it make sense to commit fraud up the entire ballot for Republicans as well? I could keep going, but these are just one of many reasons I don't think there was fraud, at least not on the large scale Trump supporters claim. It's clear the reason Trump was so adamant about the non-existent voter fraud was that he's just a sore loser, a narcissistic and a sociopath, and that's fine. Every politician is. He's certainly not unique in that aspect. But where he is unique is this. Because he's such a sore loser, a lot of his tactics scarily resemble that of actual dictators. If he wanted to lie his ass off to win votes, that's fine. Every politician does that. But when you actually try to change the election process itself, like Legal Eagle explains here.
In 2020, Trump did everything he could to overturn the results of that election, even if that meant disenfranchising millions of voters. He pressured the governor and secretary of state of Georgia to find him votes, just enough to win. And not for nothing, he encouraged the riot outside and the siege inside of the US Capitol to stop the 2020 election. For the first time since 1820, the Capitol was laid siege. He encouraged the rioters to kill Mike Pence. He sought to delay the results of the election by any means necessary. And as detailed in the DC prosecution, this was only the most visible part of a larger conspiracy to make sure that the election certification never happened. As you can see, many of Trump's crimes and conduct strike at the heart of our democracy.
This is when things get close to an actual dystopian communist dictatorship. Since he's willing to break the rule of law itself, there's no telling how far he's willing to go to get what he wants. Could he actually use the Department of Justice to silence ordinary Americans just for criticizing him? I certainly wouldn't put it beyond him.
I think that there is a non-zero chance that he would use the Department of Justice and the US military against Americans who criticize him, against ordinary Americans who he calls the enemies from within. I think that because he keeps saying explicitly that.
Project 2025 is a Republican game plan so dystopian that even Trump himself is trying to distance himself from it. I don't have time to explain it all in detail in this video, but the general idea is this. Our legal system isn't perfect. Our democracy isn't perfect. There are a great number of safeguards in place to prevent dictatorships, but they're not foolproof. And in Project 2025, Republicans have found enough legal loopholes to install enough corrupt political loyalists in Congress and the Supreme Court to essentially get anything they want. Now, as someone who's traveled extensively, I have a bit of a different perspective on this than the average American. When I grew up in America, I kind of thought that democracy, especially with all the checks and balances of the American government, was an infallible, foolproof system. But as I've traveled, I've seen plenty of countries that are technically democracies, but only in name, because the dictators have found ways to rig elections to where the results are just a foregone conclusion. The best example is Belarus, where the incredibly unpopular president has won every election since 1994 by changing the constitution itself and arresting those who oppose him. This is absolutely the kind of thing a power-hungry, sore loser like Trump could do as well. The one saving grace we have in the US Constitution is term limits. Thank God for that. The Founder Fathers really saw ahead of their time for that one. But as crazy as Trump is, who knows if he'll try to change that rule itself. On one hand, we have the possibility of a dystopian civil war, a Venezuela-like hyperinflation crisis, and a fundamental shift in the demographics of our country. And on the other, we have a dystopian fascist dictatorship with a power-hungry sore loser who tries to overturn every election that he loses and could possibly try to change the laws themselves, intimidate, and arrest political opponents, all en route to a Belarusian-style pseudo-democracy dictatorship. And this is why, in 2024, we have our perfect doomer election. So, with these two choices in front of you, which one do you think is worse? Which doomer apocalypse do you prefer? Let me know in the comments, and let's have fun discussing it.